Just to welcome everybody here, first of all, it's great to see you all here today. Particular welcome to the people who have travelled long distances. We know there are people here from different parts of the country, so it's great. We really appreciate you travelling. Having said that, we also have to welcome the people who've only come a short distance. We wouldn't like them to feel any less welcome. It's great to see you all here today. And we'd also like to welcome our friends in the national voluntary sector who are here today supporting this community campaign meeting, and we're delighted to have them here. I suppose I should do quickly the housekeeping, put the phones on silent. We don't have the, the Twitter hashtag thing. We're very old-fashioned, so you can't follow us on that, whatever it is. The phone's on silent, and the fire exits are... the fire exit is down. The door you came in, and another door down here just past it, just in case. I think that was all the formal announcements. So again, my name is Anna Quigley from Citywide. I'm just making a few comments, really opening comments before we get in, because our time is quite short today, and again, apologies, we're already a bit behind time. So I suppose firstly, why did we ask you all here today? The last couple of seminars that Citywide have organised have been around particular issues, one on intimidation and one on, I can't say the words, can't say it, couldn't say it at the time, can't say it now. And they were very important seminars to have. But this meeting today, what people were looking for was a campaign meeting. And as you know from the stuff that was sent out to you, we put this question for this meeting, the question, drugs, can we take any more? And in a way, I suppose we're being a little bit smart with the question, because to be honest with you, we know the answer. The answer is no, we can't take any more, that we've had enough. We kind of know the answer to the question. But in the agenda today, we're going to look at that question, can we take any more, in three different ways. So first of all, and you'll see this on going through your agenda, first of all what we're going to look at is in our communities, the negative impact of drugs on drug users, on the families and on the communities. And just the extent to which in our communities it's just now, well, that's the way it is. That's what you have to put up with, you know. And the sense of, over the last couple of years, a sense of just powerlessness really that a lot of us have had about being able to do anything about that, about being able to change it. And you know, one of the things that's really ironic, and that's why we put the love-hate thing on the title, it's really ironic that at this time, like the most popular TV show in the country, the ratings are at 25 billion or whatever it is, it's showing part of the impact that drugs has in our community, and people are riveted to that in its most popular show. And at the same time, official Ireland does not want to know. They do not want to hear about this. And I know it's frustrating. In the workshops that you're going to go into shortly, it'll be an opportunity for you to say what you can't take any more of in your community, what you've had enough of. And it is frustrating for people to have to say that and say it again, and people find, you know, say, well, why do we have to keep saying this? But it is very important for us that we keep saying it, even if people aren't listening. We have to be the ones saying, this is what it's like, and it is not acceptable, it is not good enough. So in the workshops, you'll get the opportunity to do that. And we'll be getting them into them shortly. The second thing then that we're looking at in terms of the question of, you know, drugs, can we take any more, is the whole thing around the strategies, the structures, the policies, the promises. And you know something, we just kind of you almost begin to feel like strategies and structures. We know we need them, right? We know you need a strategy because you need to know what it is you want to do, and you need structures because they're what deliver it. But sometimes they actually end up being your worst enemy. Because what happens now when you say, well, what's been done, or why isn't anything been done? You're told, well, there's a strategy. And sometimes it's been reviewed, and sometimes it's been evaluated, and sometimes it's gone back to another committee to be looked at again. I mean, we raised structures, we told, yeah, well, there is a report, and that's gone to someone else to have a look at, and then that'll be reviewed, and then we'll consider it again. And our point is, we don't need any more of that. We don't need any more of the structure, strategy, policy. What we need is action on that, because strategies are only any use if you implement them, and structures are only any use if they're effective in implementing stuff. And we're going to do kind of a quick overview of that. And then the third thing that we're looking at in terms of what we can't take any more of is the funding cuts. and the very severe funding cuts that we've had in the last 6 years in our communities. And Brian Harvey, who a lot of you know, is going to do a presentation on that. Brian's probably more than anybody highlighted the figures of how much the cuts have affected not only drug policy, we'll be looking at the drugs initiative, but also at wider community stuff. But not only how much it's affected those, but how out of proportion that is to the cuts in other areas, and Brian is going to talk about that. Then after that we'll go into a plenary session, and what we're really looking at then is the actions, where we go from here. So that's kind of an outline of the morning. To get started, we were going to show you a DVD. This is where I'm going to cry. We were going to show you a DVD. It was a short DVD, about 10 minutes. We have, is this making that noise where you are? Yeah. Is it? I'm probably standing too close. Can you hear me all right, yeah? Yeah. It's a bit late now if you can't. I'm not going to say all that all over again. The DVD, we have 6 national community reps on the structures. And we have Fergus McCabe, who you'll all know, who's on the National Oversight Committee. We have Joan Byrne and Ger Kirby, who's down there somewhere, who are representatives on the Drugs Advisory Group, or the Not Drugs Advisory Group. We have Teresa Wafer, who's on the National Drug Rehabilitation Implementation Committee, and we have Declan Byrne and Gary Broderick, who are on the National Advisory Committee for Drugs. Now, we had done a short DVD with all 6 of them, just giving a very quick overview of where we're at. Unfortunately, at the moment, for some reason, we can't get the sound on the DVD, so we're trying to sort that, and we'll show it after the break if we can. But just very quickly before we go into the workshops, just because you're not getting to see the DVD now, Fergus is just going to say a couple of quick words about the background, and then Tony is just going to say why the voluntary sector is important today. We'll keep that very brief, get you into the workshops, and then if we're up to time, we will, because the DVD, I mean, you know, these 6 people are all got hairdos, got makeup done and everything to appear on the screen, so we wouldn't like to deprive it of the pleasure of seeing them. So keep your fingers crossed, we get the technology sorted out in the break. So Fergus is just going to say a few quick words about generally what would be on the video if you were seeing it.
What would be on the video if you were seeing it? Yeah, that's a good one. Maybe I can... Is that okay? You hear me okay? Yeah, just to say, I mean, I wasn't expecting to be here. I was expecting to be down there looking at myself, pontificating, so it was about a minute, so I better be very quick. Basically, what I was saying and what all the community reps were saying is that this is a major problem. Everybody in this room knows it is a major problem. It has been a major problem. We've all, many people in this room have fought over the years in cooperation with various governments to try and do something effective, to do something based on evidence, to do something that impacts on the areas where it's worst. We've always recognised in Citywide, and I know the evidence shows that its poorest communities throughout Ireland are worst hit by both drugs and alcohol. That was reiterated this morning. If anyone heard the news in relation to children taken into care, child reform group, Carol Coulter was reporting that 90% or over 90% of kids taken into care because of drugs and alcohol abuse and deprivation. So that's always been our stance. Poor communities are hit the worst. Perhaps that's why the issue isn't addressed with the seriousness it deserves. Any response, as we know, has to be interagency, intersectoral, and we had developed in this country probably one of the most innovative and evidence-based responses. That was in many ways the envy of many countries in Europe. Why? Because it genuinely engaged with people on the ground, and people enthusiastically got involved. And I can look around this room and see people who have given years of service to the state as volunteers, as true citizens on all these structures. And of course, structures aren't the panacea and so forth, but they're important. And when we spent so much time and energy in them, it's important that they're given the resources to do the job, as they were in the early days. And again, going back to evidence that's shown, there was money put into it, there was new projects set up, etc. And we were beginning, and it's a huge issue everywhere, but we were beginning to make progress. Then from Nola Hearn on, it began to unravel. We still tried to cooperate, we still tried to take part, and the tragedy is, at a time when the problem now again is massive, and we know, as Anna said, and as you all have that thing there with the list of reports, we know what has to be done. Some of us here, Tony, myself, Sadie, we're on the alcohol, substance misuse, which there's a launch of some of the government's actions tomorrow, which again, I'm sure is going to be very disappointing. Why? Because we spent years, 3 years, at least working on this. There had been 4 or 5 previous reports on alcohol, all recommending pretty much the same recommendations that we came up with. Not radical, but again evidence-based. Tony Houlihan, the boss of the thing, is a very serious person, and he was very balanced. Very serious recommendations, like all of them. It's working now. Okay, well, you can't show me now because I'm just finished. So the problem, and the problem really is that if this government is serious about doing something, it has to do it. It can't just do a yes minister report after report, and that's what's been happening. And as I said, we've been patient, we've stuck with them, but I think patience has to go. They really have to get a message that enough is enough. This problem is too serious. It needs real action. Leadership is about leadership. Leadership is about taking on vested interests. If this government hasn't got the guts to take on the vested interests in the alcohol and sports industries, well then there's a very bleak future for all our children. And the minimum we can do is try and give them a better future, and I'm sure we'll do that. Thanks very much.
Fergus is so great, you know, he wanted you to have the live version, but the DVD, we'll now put on the DVD. I know we're running a bit behind time, but we'll make it up on this, so we'll stick it on now.
The initial Pat Rabbit report in the middle 90s acknowledged that the community was at the heart of responding to the drugs crisis. And you know, nothing has changed about that. That still holds true, because nothing can happen without the community involvement. The consistent erosion of the community involvement, the fact that the community sector is treated with so little respect by the powers that be. Decisions are made on our behalf many times by civil servants who have no idea what a drug problem looks like, who've never been affected by it, who never had a family member addicted to drugs, who never had a family member die from an overdose, deliberate or otherwise. And yet they can decide, well, this is going to get cut and that is going to get cut. And the first thing that goes is that whole notion of community development. I heard this famous phrase about, it's important to maintain frontline services. And you know, if all you do is maintain frontline services, all you have left is a line. You don't have a front line because you've got nothing at your back. And the thing that the community has always had at its back is the ability to be able to come together, talk about, analyse what it is going on in the community and develop responses. And that doesn't happen by osmosis. That takes resources. That's what's called networking. That's community development. And that's the bit that has been targeted, undermined, thrown out and poo-pooed basically by government. And if that bit isn't resourced and isn't maintained, there's nothing else coming up the line.
It's very important that in the drug situation that community development principles are held also. The task forces on their own right have done and are doing some good work, but they're doing so very much in isolation now. We do need to have an input from the community at all aspects and all levels in the process of dealing with the drugs problem. The current trend in drugs problems in the regions they really have developed a heroin problem, particularly large centres such as Waterford, Limerick, to a lesser extent Galway, which now has discovered that there's injecting heroin going on there, which up to quite recently hadn't been the case. Also at Lone, and the satellite towns or villages such as Thurles and Portlaoise and Roscrea are also affected by the heroin problem. The heroin problem is mainly dealt with through methadone maintenance. When people present for treatment, they're usually put on the methadone maintenance, and that's fine in the short term.
We were able to interview, I think it was over 700 school-going children in the area and a number of early school leavers. And that clearly showed the beginnings of a trend. And the trend is that people unfortunately have become addicted to heroin, by and large have remained addicted to heroin, and in some cases they've gone on to polydrug use. But the generation behind them are not in any significant number using heroin. What they're primarily using is alcohol and cannabis. The HSE in the Dublin North area has just completed a very good report which admits that the treatment services have been very much heroin focused, and then there's this urgent need to provide services, particularly to young people, who have become addicted to alcohol or drugs of a non-heroin, non-opiate nature. And services have to be developed at local level that will help young people, particularly in the 15 to 25 age group, who find themselves chronically addicted to alcohol, cannabis, and or cocaine, benzodiazepines, Nurofen Plus, or Sulfadil. And I think there's an urgent need to recognise the emerging trends and for the services to be put in at a local level to help young people.
There hasn't been any real investment. What we have seen is a string of reductions, in particular, I suppose, from the community employment programme, the drug rehabilitation places. We had a decrease in the training budget over the last year. I think there was 50% cut. And I mean, it's a key factor in terms of the rehabilitation and the recovery of young people. The training element is crucial in that care plan. And then, of course, I mean, the disability, the benefits that was cut, it created a barrier for young people coming on the drugs programme. There was a real fear, you know, if they go on a programme, if they relapse, if they go back out, will they get a disability, will they have an income? And I suppose the reductions has also affected staff in terms of burnout, because we have, you know, the emerging trends of drug culture has changed. In the past we would have seen, you know, a big increase in opiate users. The polydrug use is now cocaine, benzos, weed, and it brings its own problems. The treatment services obviously aren't adequately equipped to deal with it. You might see a drop in people attending for methadone programs, and obviously that gives the false conclusion that we don't have the big massive drug problem that we had in the past, but we do. You have young people coming to the project with their families, and the problem is increasing, but the resources are decreasing. So we don't have the tools there, and reductions have played a part in making sure people just haven't got, they're not equipped to deal with the drugs problems in their local community. That voice has been taken away.
It was either heroin or drink. Throughout the 90s, maybe there was introduction of other tablets, and certainly the arrival of methadone, which was a good thing. But the choices that a lot of our service users had to make were limited. They were narrower. This morning, I spoke with some of the women from Sale, and they were listing off all of the drugs that they could choose from. And they listed off Zimavane, Lyrica, Super Socks, the man-made substances or illegal made substances, white D10s coming in from England, ecstasy as blue ghosts, ketamine, snowblow, Xanax or Upjohns, a thing that they called blocks that they weren't too sure about, and that wasn't mentioning just crack, crystal meth, and then a re-emergence of tryptazole. And that's on top of the excessive alcohol use, and on top of methadone, and on top of heroin. And it just feels now that you almost need a pharmacology degree in order to be able to work on the streets, because there's so much to choose from. You need to know all of the ins and outs of how these drugs, not only what they do, but how they work together. And the demands that are on our staff teams are increasing all the time because of the complications that come with the mixes and availabilities of drugs that are there. And that's working with the clients who actually make it as far as our services, because we don't have the resources to go out and meet all of the new users, all of the people who are drifting into drug use for 101 reasons, a lot of the time related to the fact that poverty is an ongoing issue that's getting worse and worse with the passing of every budget. And people are losing income on almost, it feels like, weekly basis, so that they're not able to cope with all of the problems that are out there. And in so doing, they're using lots of drink, they're using lots of tablets, they're using lots of street drugs that are available. And the kind of issues that we find ourselves having to be expert on are things like deciding whether you can even talk to a client because of memory loss related to tablets they might have taken, issues of child protection, issues of domestic violence, issues of debt and intimidation, all on top of those kind of things of marginalisation that all go with drug use to begin with. So now, more than ever before, we've a space where you have to be expecting your staff to be experts at all of these levels, while the resources are being drained away and staff numbers are being reduced and more people are knocking at the door.
it's still a major problem. It's probably even a bigger problem now when you consider taking into account alcohol and what we've done with alcohol over the last 10 or 15 years. I think it's also very important to stress that, you know, the problem as then 15 years ago is still concentrated in areas of disadvantage. So the poorest areas in our society, the poorest communities suffer the brunt of the drugs problem, be that the illegal drugs problem or the alcohol problem. I think that's undeniable. We've had evidence over the years about the number of people who end up in prison, the number of people who end up in treatment. Again, the vast proportion of people who are suffering in a very serious way, particularly from illegal drugs, are from poor, deprived communities. So any response has to be multifaceted, has to be interagency, has to be partnership-based. That was recognised in the earlier years of the National Drug Strategy. And the tragedy is that at a time when the problem facing the poorest communities in the society is still as bad, and in many ways worse, we are not now taking that partnership approach, that the National Drug Strategy is beginning to unravel. The very good interagency structures that we had developed, which were probably unique in Europe, involving the community sector, the voluntary sector in the state, those structures have, you know, not gone away, but they've certainly been really seriously weakened. And there's a huge sense of frustration, disappointment and anger in communities. And instead of building on the strengths of what was a successful drugs policy, involving people in the poorest communities, involving citizens all over this country, in every county. Instead of building on what was working, we've let that unravel, and that's a real tragedy.
So we're going to just have a quick input now from Tony Gagan, who you all know. Tony is the voluntary sector rep on the board of Citywide, and is also, just on behalf of the voluntary sector network, just saying why they're supporting the campaign meeting today.
Now, hi all, good morning. So, first of all, they didn't get me on video. I was very disappointed. I wasn't asked even to get a video, you know. I live in hope anyway, you know. I'll give you my agent's number and we'll work it out. Anyway, first of all, I do, on behalf of the voluntary sector, I want to thank Citywide for allowing us the opportunity to participate in today's event. Because, like Citywide, the voluntary sector have become extremely concerned about the whole unravelling of the National Drug Strategy. And we want to join with the community sector in calling for an urgent overhaul of the National Drug Strategy structures and for a recommitment from the government to the original partnership approach that was embodied in the original drug strategy. I suppose, by way of introduction, I should say what I mean by the voluntary sector. For those that don't really know us or aren't involved, by the voluntary sector, we are a national network of non-governmental organisations involved in drug and alcohol treatment. And in fact, we would include all of the main treatment services that are here in Dublin and all around the country. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that the voluntary sector do play a significant role in providing drug and alcohol treatment, and in fact provide most of the residential detox beds and all of the drug-free residential rehabilitation beds in the country. Now, over the last number of years, the voluntary sector, or as a sector, we've become increasingly concerned about the stagnation and the disintegration or the dismantling of the National Drug Strategy. You know, in the past, like the community sector, the voluntary sector were represented on the National Drug Strategy team, and we were actively involved in all of the decision-making processes in terms of strategy, what was to be rolled out, in terms of how funding was to be made. But over the last few years, what we've experienced has been an erosion of this whole involvement, and with all of that authority and the decision-making powers being withdrawn and being pulled back into the department. And while all that has been going on, meanwhile, of course, we all know that drug use on the ground remains a very serious issue, both here in Dublin and in many parts of the country. And in fact, I know there's people from around the country here today that it's probably outside of Dublin, you know, where the growth of drug use is most noticeable. You know, in Merchants Quay, Ireland's residential detox service, in the year to date, this year so far, we've had admissions from 16 different counties around the country, which I think is a real, for detox from heroin, methadone and benzos. So I think that's a real indicator of that kind of spread. And I think, again, we all know from our past experiences in the 80s and in the 90s that when austerity and poverty and hardship continues to bite on people, that inevitably more people end up getting caught up in the whole drug scenario, more young people. That was the youth unemployment in the 80s, fed into that whole drug surge in the 80s, and we know that's going to happen and is already happening again. I think already as voluntary agencies around the country, we are struggling to cope, because on the one hand we have increased demand for treatment services, but on the other hand we've had year-on-year reductions in funding for treatment services. So we're stuck with that kind of paradox, I know even in our own services in Merchants Quay, and I did a ready reckoner that since 2008 we've had over 700,000 euro reduced out of our state funding. And other voluntary organisations have experienced similar reductions. And the only way that we manage to keep providing services is through efficiencies, through trying to reorganise the services and relying on fundraising income, relying on the general public to support our services. But at this point, if the ongoing level of cuts continues, there's a very real danger that voluntary agencies are going to have to cut back their treatment provision, or some agencies may in fact close. And what's so ironic is that this is at the very time when they're needed most and when there is most demand for services. And I think what compounds this situation and what makes it even more frustrating is that there are no functioning national structures, where we can take these issues, where we can challenge these issues. Like the community sector, we, the voluntary sector, are involved in all the regional drug task forces and on the local drug task forces. But there's still no longer a central coordinating body with community and voluntary sector representation where these issues can be discussed, where they can be examined and where decisions can be made. As a sector, we've been making this point for the last number of years on numerous occasions with the Minister and with officials in the department. But like the community sector, we've seen no shift, no movement, no response coming back at all. What we hope for from today is that, through the interaction here, through the roundtable discussions, through the plenary sessions, that we as a sector, can come to some sort of agreed position, or start to come to an agreed position with the community sector about how do we want to be involved, or do we want to be involved in this drug strategy going forward, and if so, how are we going to do it? Now, as a sector, the voluntary sector, we want to be involved. We know that drug treatment works, and we see people that come into drugs and come out the other end, and that's really what it's all about. That we do have to provide pathways out, and we know it works. But we want a fully functioning national drug strategy with community and voluntary sector involved as equal partners in the process. And we need the government to put these structures in place to allow that to happen now, right now. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony. I'm going to move on really quickly now because we need to get into the workshops. We're going to run, because we're starting them late, we're going to run them till 20 to 12. My apologies to the facilitators for messing up the timetable completely. But we'll go into the workshops now and run them till 20 to 12. And just very quickly, the workshops, again, as we say, are an opportunity to look at, in your communities, the impact of the drugs problem. We all know it, but again, we have to keep getting the message out there about what the reality is. And just as a prompt for that, because when we talk about a community drugs problem, sometimes people say, what do you mean? So very quickly, these are the things we're talking about. And these are things you all know, but the availability and range of drug use in all our communities. There might be different patterns of drug use, but the availability is huge of all kinds of drugs. Visibility of drug use and drug dealing, that's an interesting one, that over a few years people felt drug dealing and drug use had become less visible, but very much now, particularly for local residents, it mightn't be as obvious to the people passing by, but people feel it's very clearly becoming visible again and very obvious to people what's going on. The familiarity, normality of drug use and drug dealing in the community. And it's interesting, somebody was saying to me, like, in one way that's about it, it just becomes so normal, it's usual. But someone else said to me, actually, when it's really normal is when you've stopped noticing it, and that's happening to people too, that they're not even noticing it anymore because it's so normal. Obviously, another thing is serious and health issues and premature deaths. And the thing about that, it's in younger people. It's not in the age group where you expect to see the really serious health problems and deaths. It's in younger people. The identification of housing areas as drug hotspots. Again, we see that in our communities. People are saying, I don't want to go and live there. Or drug users in recovery are coming out of programmes are saying, I don't want to be housed there. And particular areas are seen as hotspots. The social nuisance, loss of community space, again we know about, particular community spaces where people feel that there's drug use going on, don't get used by other people. And again, even for drug users, they often feel that even if they gather together anywhere in the community, they are seen as a nuisance. The perception of community safety and increased crime. We always get this stuff about the statistics are going down in terms of everything, crime statistics. But again, if people don't feel safe in their areas, then that has a huge impact. And that obviously links into what has come out as a huge issue over the last few years, the huge increase in intimidation, particularly around the drug markets. Intimidation that affects drug users, affects their families, but also affects the wider community and increases the level of fear. And then the last one there, and this is the huge thing, it's all about the community pride and networks, and the impact of drugs it's been about, in many ways, dividing communities and who's blaming who for the problems and who's been held responsible, and as well too that sense of, well, the best thing to do now is just keep your head down, keep your eyes, don't get involved, which goes against everything that we're part of and goes against the whole idea of communities responding. So you can ignore the last one for the moment because we will be coming on to the resources issue later. But they're just a prompt. They're the kind of issues that we talk about when we talk about community drugs problems. So now, in the workshops, you get a chance just to say what are the main things that you've had enough of, I suppose, in your own areas. So you all get started on that now. And sorry again for the time delay. in your packs you have this printed leaflet. The title on it, as you can see, is Statements, Strategies, Policies and Promises. And I suppose very quickly, I just want to quickly say a few words about this while we put this together. Again, I think Fergus commented on this earlier, and I know like people say that the community sector, both community and voluntary sector they say it about, but I think particularly about communities, that we're always moaning. We get accused of that, you lot, you're always moaning. And in fact, we produced it. This shows the opposite of that. What you're seeing there, all those lists of strategies, policy documents, research reports, a lot of people in this room, a lot of other people from communities have put hours, days, weeks, months of their lives into the production of those documents and those strategies and those action plans. And we've done that in partnership. We've worked, because we know you need all of the agencies together, we've worked in partnership with a whole range of agencies over the years. And we've produced all of these strategies, policies, actions, which show us we know what we need to do. We know what needs to be done. It's already, all the work has already been done. We've played a huge part in doing that. And we don't need any more to say, well, we need another working group, we need another strategy. We have it all there. And we're not saying that none of this has been implemented. There are, particularly in the earlier days, quite a few things were implemented from these strategy documents and policies. But again, it's the frustration, the real frustration, like what you've been talking about up to now, is what the issues are. And we have put enormous time and effort and energy into what are the answers. Because we have to, on the ground, community and voluntary services, they're dealing with the issues on a day-to-day basis, so we have to respond. We've put such huge energy into that. And what is so frustrating is when you see these, the responses being put into action, and you see them starting to work, and then they're abandoned. Or with some of the proposals in these documents, they've never been implemented. And just very quickly, a couple of quick examples. I'm not going to go through them all because it's much too, and I have to put I hate putting my glasses on in public, but I can't read if I don't. Just quick examples. The 1996, the first report, that gave us the NDST. It wasn't a perfect structure, but it was a hell of a lot better than we have now. We got rid of that. 1997, the second report, that gave us the Young People's Facility Services Fund. Made a huge difference in a lot of local communities. That's gone. We don't even have a committee now to oversee how those services are being run. 2001, really significant one. At the time that the National Drug Strategy was launched, 2001, RAPID was launched. And the reason it was launched at that time, and the government said it very clearly, they said, we cannot solve the drugs problem unless we address the broader issues of investment in local communities. Set up RAPID to do that. We all know where RAPID is now, or isn't. It has been drained away over the years to where it's practically nothing. Again, you can see there's a whole range of reports there looking at the needs of different groups, different target groups. So again, no matter what drug issue you're looking at, we do have recommendations about what needs to be done. We see the family support work is in there. Again, same thing, recommendations about what need to be done. If you come, another example, just quickly, 2007, the report of the Working Group on Drugs Rehab. Yes, ENDRIC was set up. We're aware of that. The committee was set up and established, and they have been working. But look, Teresa referred to it on the DVD. Look what's happening. Still the basic core support for drugs rehabilitation in this country is CE. And we all know what's happening to CE now. Not only is there nothing new being developed, but the one piece that was there that was really supporting drugs rehabilitation is under serious threat. There are quite a few CE projects who really don't believe they can keep going and they can't continue to carry out their work. So even though we have the 2007 report and we have ENDRIC, the practice, the reality is actually going in a different direction. And again, it was mentioned earlier, there will be a lot of coverage today now of the launch. It's being referred to as the launch of the substance misuse strategy. I think what it is the publication of legislation around pricing of drink. But again, what we see for the last 3 years, since it was agreed that the task forces would take on the issue of alcohol, the last 3 years we have been saying, if that's going to happen, that needs to be looked at. You need to look at, well, what does that mean in local communities? What does that mean for local services? What does it mean for task forces? What does it mean for resources? None of that discussion has taken place. So alcohol is now in the brief, and no additional resources, no supports around it. So that's, again, it's just to make the point, we do know what needs to be done. We don't need any more research, we don't need any more reports, we don't need any more strategies, we have them. We know what needs to be done. We as a sector, the community sector, also the voluntary sector, have put enormous effort into come up with these solutions. What we need now is action. And I think you should just read the final, on the front page of this, the final quote that's there is from our current Minister, James Riley, from 2 weeks ago, acknowledging that drugs is one of the most serious challenges facing our country. Well, it's not much use saying that when your track record shows that you don't do anything about it. And just so, in a way of introducing our next speaker, I suppose the question is, and I suppose we all know all the answers to the questions we're asking, why is it not happening? If we know what the problem is, we know what needs to be done, why is it not being done? And obviously some of the key answers in that are around the state response to drugs issue over the last number of years, not just the funding issues, but the broader response. And Brian Harvey, who many of you will know, an independent consultant who's done more than anyone, I think, to highlight the scale of the cuts to the community and voluntary sector, but also, crucially, how out of proportion that is to the cuts being applied elsewhere. That there's absolutely no question the community voluntary sector, including the drugs side, is experiencing much, much greater cuts than is happening across broader services. So Brian is going to talk to you in a bit more detail about this now, and I think you have copies of his presentations.
Hi, good morning. I've been asked to speak this morning about the evolution of community-based services in general and community-based services addressing the drugs issue in particular. And my presentation to you this morning has 3 parts: the past, the present and the future. And I'm going to start with the past because it's important in informing us where we are now and our current situation. Ireland has traditionally been an underdeveloped peripheral European society in which low priority has been given to welfare and with a limited vision of the role of civil society, by which I mean voluntary and community organisations, non-governmental organisations and NGOs. The 1960s, though, saw the beginning of voluntary and community-led responses to poverty and social exclusion, and you saw that in the movements against poor housing in Dublin and the early community development programmes of that period, or projects of that period. 1975 was a landmark, and again we owe it to Europe for bringing this in, the first programme against poverty, and it validated the idea, the concept of ground-based, research-based, bottom-up, community-led, policy-orientated campaigning responses. And that was formally endorsed in the report of that programme. The 1980s and 1990s, as you know, saw a substantial expansion of community-led initiatives, projects and responses, including those against drugs. And the last 2 words are important, which worked, because they did have definite results and outcomes for the communities in which they worked. The high point came in the period 1997 to 2002. The high point came because we had the National Anti-Poverty Strategy, introduced by Principes de Rossa in 1997, the White Paper supporting voluntary activity in the year 2000, which affirmed the independent role of the voluntary and community sector, its role against social exclusion, the idea that there would be liaison units in each government department to which voluntary and community groups would work, and further expansion and particularly support for the infrastructure of the voluntary sector. Plus a range of sectoral strategies, including, of course, the National Drugs Strategy, with implementation systems, making public administration much more sophisticated and effective in what it did, and the introduction of National Social Partnership. And in particular, you had the Combat Poverty Agency, which began in the mid-1980s, which funded national anti-poverty networks, small grant schemes, research grants, the capacity building of local and small groups with a programme of research, the Community Development Programme with 180 projects, advertised rightly to the rest of Europe as a flagship programme and a good model of how you do community development work. The Family Resource Centres, likewise, 106 of them. And the refining of policies against poverty, for example, child poverty. The agency showed that if you increase child benefit, you will reduce child poverty. And the government did, at least at that time, accept that advice, and no surprise, child poverty was actually reduced during that period. The problem is what happened in 2002 when we had what I call a strategic turn. And that took place in June 2002. I don't think I can recall any single not a change of government when the same parties were re-elected to government, but which brought about greater political change than in the election that took place in May of that year. Funding for voluntary and community organisations was delayed and then reduced 47%. Research funding was scrapped altogether on the basis that we don't need any more expert reports. Voluntary activity units were not progressed, and we still don't have them, and we suffer because we don't, because it's difficult to open doors into some government departments. The policy unit for community development projects was actually scrapped within days of the two new ministers coming into office in the new Department of Community, Rural and Community and Rural Development. There was the removal of the funding role of the Combat Poverty Agency, all of which were hoovered into the new Department of Community Development and put under ministerial control there. So ministers decided exactly who got money and who did not. And that process also led on to the Charities Act of 2009, which was passed, but important sections relating to the voluntary sector were suspended. But what they did pass was a section which decreed that human rights were no longer a charitable field of activity, although they had been in the state up to that point. And there is increasing evidence of charities being refused charitable status, which is important if you want to get grants, on the basis that they also now do campaigning. And those are significant changes that have happened only in the past couple of years. With the breaking of the economic and social crisis in 2008, and I don't use the word recession, recession is the failure to achieve economic growth in more than 2 quarters in a row. I think we can agree that what has happened since 2008 is more serious than that. The Combat Poverty Agency was abolished. Other social agencies were extinguished. And it's interesting when we look at a list of those that have been extinguished. They are the National Council for Ageing and Older People. Its staff transferred into the Minister's Department to answer parliamentary questions. The National Economic and Social Forum, CORE, the Forum for Voluntary Organisations Working in the Environmental Area, the National Consultative Council on Racism and Interculturalism, the Office for Active Citizenship, the Homeless Agency, important advisory committees in the area of women's health, educational disadvantage and childhood development, the reduction, severe reductions in funding in both the Equality Authority and the Irish Human Rights Commission, and instead new economic agencies created, including the biggest one in the history of the state, which we all know and love as NAMA. The Community Development Programme was closed, including as part of that the Dublin Inner City Partnership, and limits were set to dissent as to what voluntary and community groups should do. Specifically look at clause 2.8 of the Standard Service Level Agreement issued by the HSE, which specifies that you may not follow courses of action designed to persuade people to follow a particular policy or practice. Why is it our Irish state is so terrified that people trying to persuade people to do something is considered a threat to them, but it is. Looking at the funding, if we look at overall funding, I'm going to move on a slide and then come back to this one. If we look at overall government spending, if I were to ask you how much do you think government spending has gone down in the past 5 years, the papers I think would lead us to believe that it's been an awful lot. But if we go onward, we find that the actual fall in government spending has not been that enormous. It's been minus 7.1% from 2008. It actually went up in 2009, as you can see, to 7.1% to 2014, next year's figures. But to come back for a second, there was never a formal statement from government that social policy spending would be particularly affected. But as we come and look in the figures more detail, that does appear to be what would happen. On the other hand, if we do look at the so-called Programme for National Recovery, it is very interesting that those spending cuts that are specified in the most detail are those that are in the social policy area. In practice, voluntary and community organisations have seen their funding fall by between -8 and -10%, not over 5 years, but over each year. So there's been a huge difference as to what has happened. The only commitment from government never said, and was never honest enough to say to us, we will reduce all social spending because, like some ideologists of the right, they believe in that. But instead, they only said, we will attempt to preserve frontline services. And that was the only definitive commitment that we got from government. If we look at the actual spend and the actual changes, we see some quite remarkable figures. And I ask you to bear in mind the -7.1% figure, because that's the baseline against which everything else should be measured. The Local and Community Development Programme down 43.3%. Remember, against 7%, so it's 6 times higher than that. And it is due to be integrated with the local authorities on the 1st of July, so if we're having this meeting in a year's time, it will probably not even be on a chart because it'll be fully integrated into the local authorities. It will be gone like the Community Development Programme before that. Initiatives against drugs, which obviously are the key concern and interest today, down minus 37%. And this, like the LCDP, a programme targeted to the most disadvantaged communities. And that is general government spending. The problem, though, is when we look at the statements issued from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform the other day, let's look at the more detailed headings because this is interesting. On the left-hand column, you see the current funding for those government departments that most fund voluntary and community organisations. In the middle column, you see the bottoming out next year. And at the right-hand column, you hope to see the gradual increase in 2016. But if anyone can see a figure on the right-hand column that is higher than a figure in the middle column, please tell me. Because we see, unfortunately, the conclusion from this is that when there will be a general rise in spending in 2016, social spending is not amongst those areas to benefit from that increase. So that increase will go somewhere else. And it's rather interesting that not only has government said that it's protecting frontline services, but that it is also protecting the poor. But let's look at the figures. And these are not my figures. These are the figures supplied by the Central Statistics Office in cooperation with the European Commission. And this is what's called EU SILC, or the European Union Standards of Income and Living Conditions. And it shows a very interesting thing. It shows the level of poverty, or the proportion of people below the 60% poverty line, declining until 2009. And you can see from 2009 it begins to rise again, with the proportion of people below the poverty line increasing from 14.1% to 16%. And it's even higher for children, and it's rather interesting furthermore that the rate of increase is higher than what has happened in Greece. Let's move on to the drug services, because I think this does invite the question of why reduce drug services. And you saw the minus 37% figure I put up to you a moment ago. Why reduce that so much? Because we know that local drug services lead to gains in health, in criminal justice, in policing and in employment. The Home Office in Britain estimates that there is between a 3-to-1 and a 9-to-1 cost-benefit positive outcome from these investments. And in terms of savings on other spendings. We know of gains deriving from local and community-based drug services, and it's worth maybe reminding ourselves of some of these arguments in just a moment, because they come from the Good Body's review of the local drugs task forces in 2006. And we also know the consequences of cuts. So I know people here will be very familiar with this, but it is sometimes worth just reminding ourselves just how important these things are. The Good Body findings, okay, where that local services did need to improve trust and cooperation with the Gardaí. The sources of supply were identified, that there was reduced drug use generally, and specifically the prevention of use by children. That teachers intervened more early and more effectively. That there was a challenge to open dealing. That more people became drug-free or stayed drug-free for longer. That there was a normalisation in their personal and community lives. That practical help and support was given to their families, which is all important, and there was a prevention of relapse. We know those were the concrete outcomes. And let's remember, we listen quite often to a government that speaks about evidence-based policy making. This is the evidence. And let us look at the consequences of cuts, which Citywide itself has documented. Fewer people using services, longer waiting lists, a higher prevalence of drug use, earlier addiction by children, more ill health attributable to drugs, including early mortality, a failure to stop supply and dealing, higher rates of crime, intimidation, antisocial behaviour, break-ins, a relapse by existing users, slower normalisation, a diminished ability of the Gardaí to respond, and a decline in the security and in the quality of life. That's the evidence. That is our evidence-based policy making. So how do we explain the cuts? And in this era of evidence-based policy making, they make no sense. I consider them to be literally irrational and anti-rational. Why, if all the evidence tells you that this is a good investment, government pulls the money from it? It makes no sense. It runs counter to all the European advice that is available. it runs counter to the approach of most European governments. Jacques Delors many years ago said that economic and social progress must advance together, hand in hand. The economic benefits the social benefits the economic. And I question, what is the coherence behind this? Because you've seen the figures. Why 43% here, 30% there, 20% somewhere else? It's almost the throwing darts at a darts board and hitting a particular number. There's been never any explanation. And I would actually question how much the ministers concerned have been asked to explain the differentials in these different cuts. Okay? We can see that protecting frontline services is a falsehood when we go through the evidence that we've heard here. But there is an underlying implicit pattern against social policy and its institutions, so many of which, as you can see, have now been disbanded. An implicit pattern against voluntary organisations in general, if their funding is down 8 to 10% a year, which is more than the total government fall over 5 or 6 years. And against community-based organisations in particular, because the cuts in community-based services targeted at disadvantaged areas have been markedly and identifiably higher. I wonder, is an attempt to settle scores with civil society and voluntary organisations for maybe becoming too important, too outspoken, too articulate. The only consolation we can draw from this that the attempt to remove voluntary and community organisations from the Constitution, and it was an attempt to remove them from the Constitution on the 4th of October, was defeated by the people. Let's look at the policy responses that have been made to this difficult situation. And there has been work done to try examine this and try confront this. And I think it's important that we be positive and look at the counter-arguments, the counter-narratives, the counter-evidence that has been presented in the face to what is being done by government. There's the impact research that has been done by the Congress of Trade Unions, by Pavie Point, obviously related to the travellers. There's the budgetary analysis done by the Wheel, done by Task, and done by the NARI Institute. Because they have presented alternatives and alternative approaches. They are there. They're there to be read, they're there to be studied, they're there to be presented to our political leadership. There have been challenges to these policies in the Oireachtas, principally by the independent deputies and senators and by Sinn Féin members as well, who have challenged government head-on a lot of these things. But if we look at the overall picture of how we responded in the voluntary and community sector, it presents a very wide picture, somewhere between passivity and defiance at the other end, in particular the Spectacle of Defiance parade led by St Michael's Estate Family Resource Centre. It's rather interesting, and this was a film shot that was shown on Channel 4, but not on RTE, when the Greeks were out marching, and of course they were chanting this in Greek, not in English. But the subtitles showed that what the Greeks were chanting were not the Irish, we're the Greeks, we do not capitulate. Okay? And that, I think, puts in some context the very different levels of response from our two countries. But there have been attempts to, and I think the other thing is there has been little traction for these counter-arguments in the media, where all that is happening is we've been portrayed as the unfortunate casualties of recession. The government had no other choice. You can see from the figures there were plenty of other choices. And alternative analysis and proposals have been presented through the Claiming Our Future movement and through academic analyses such as Mary Murphy's Second Republic. And those are the kind of counter-arguments that we should learn, we should read, and we should use as the basis for our argument for challenging and changing what has been happening to us. So just if we could look at some of the futures, this is my last slide. What we've seen, I think, is a quite unimaginable reversal from where we were in the year 2001. No one, that I know of anyway, anticipated the wave of destruction of our social and community development infrastructure that took place from June 2002, where Ireland was a European leader. As someone once said recently, no one saw this coming. And in doing that, we see a radical departure from the European social model. Isn't it interesting that the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Iveta Radičová, says that civil society must be at the heart of policy making in a modern democracy? How far have we got from little Slovakia in only 12 years? There's a working assumption that with recovery all will be well again. This is highly questionable. Certainly the evidence is not in the figures. Certainly for us, all will not be well again in 2016. There is a real danger that austerity is set to continue for civil society and for social policy, a sort of post-austerity austerity. And I would also question, do we really want the Celtic Tiger model back? Because that seems to be the best that the government can come up with at the moment, is maybe kinder, gentler Celtic Tiger, but it's still a very unequal one. And I think it behoves us to start making the case, and hopefully we'll make that now with ever greater effectiveness, for a more enlightened, balanced European social model applied to Ireland with a strong role for civil society. Isn't it interesting that 100 years ago it was civil society organisations, voluntary and community groups that helped to build the new Irish state, particularly in 4 key areas. Housing, where Dublin 100 years ago had an appalling housing problem, groups working in communities, in feminism, in the Irish language and in culture, and they helped to build a new state. It's also striking how there is no government plan for post-recovery, and it contrasts so dramatically with what happened in, and I'm going back into the history just for a last point, when Britain was besieged in 1942 on all fronts by Germany, Japan and the other Axis powers. What did it do? It said, right, we're at war, we start planning for the peace now. And in Britain was produced in 1942 at the height of the conflict, the Beveridge Plan, which said, we shall have, when this is all over, a modern welfare state. We shall have a national health service. And that lifted the expectations of not only the soldiers, but all the people, which said, we're never going back to where we were before. So let that give us heart as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. I think all of you have a copy of that presentation there, and take that and take it back with you, take it to everybody. I think what Brian's presentation is hugely important for us in terms of where we go from here. We have earlier on our own experience, we know what's happening on the ground, we know the reality, but that presentation really brings it together with the facts and the figures. Basically it goes to show that we're not paranoid, they are really out to get us. We are going to have a really quick feedback on the 5 key points. 30 seconds feedback on the key points just before we get into the plenary. And thanks again to Brian, that's been a hugely useful presentation for us.
Okay, so we don't have to time me. If I go over 30 seconds, you can fire things at me. We just drew together from all of the feedback from the groups, and many thanks for all your work in there, 5 key points. But all of the work and all of the input you have is being recorded and will be produced as a report to this seminar. But the 5 areas mainly were, the number 1 priority and problem and impact on communities was intimidation and violence. And that was street violence, but also violence in family members, sometimes sons to daughters, and others, people taking beatings to pay, or willing to take beatings to pay off debts. The second most prevalent point to come up was the issue of polydrug use, and that included alcohol. And added to that was this whole normalisation of drug use, that it seems to be now the accepted thing that people are using 2, 3, 4, 5 different drugs. I don't think any service is seeing people coming in the door with an addiction to one particular substance anymore. And also access to drugs has changed, the routes are changed, the internet access, things like that have changed considerably. The third most common thing to be mentioned was a kind of a depletion of communities, you know, that communities were tired, that whole link between poverty and drug use is still, you know, stands true. There's been a huge depletion of their role in playing a part in implementing responses, and people are genuinely tired and kind of fed up with that. And issues like housing were mentioned, and resource cutbacks and lack of services, and also a kind of a feeling of a lack of hope. The fourth most common thing to be mentioned was the issue of health, and that included not just physical health and people being really sick, not looking after themselves. Their money was being depleted because of the welfare cutbacks. Evidence of people paying, you know, maybe €100 a week just to feed a weed habit, never mind all the other drugs, and that was from a 200 a week income from social welfare. People not eating because of that and getting sicker. There was mental health issues, and there was also deaths and suicides mentioned. And the fifth most common thing mentioned was the issue of young people. That issue not being addressed. It's a whole area that's not been addressed, certainly by the state. And there was a huge a growing problem outside of Dublin and outside of major cities, particularly involving young people with benzos and weed that wasn't being addressed. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. I know it wasn't 30 seconds, but it was quick. It was quick. Can you hear me okay with the mic down here, yeah? Just the plenary now. Actually, is Tony there? Tony Gagan? Are you hiding? If Tony can come up to the top table. Just on the plenary, we are short of time. I know what we've got on the agenda is plan of action, and we're being realistic. Obviously, we know that in the next 20 minutes, half an hour, we're not going to, come up with agreed actions. What we're going to do is any ideas you have about what you think we should do from here. If you can present them in sort of as brief a form as you can, we will take those away and we will come back with an action plan. And we're not naive. We know absolutely, because even today people sometimes feel, yeah, well, we'll come and we'll say all this stuff and we'll all get really angry about it. But what can we do? And we have to keep saying to ourselves, okay, we're not going to change this. I mean, the scale of it, Brian has clearly shown. We're not going to change this overnight. We're not going to change it on our own. But we have to start identifying things that we can do. We have to start saying, no, we can't be passive. We can't sit back. We can't continue to let this happen. So any specific ideas people have, we're happy to hear them now in the plenary. But again, we take them on board and we will come back to you with a more worked out plan, because we simply aren't going to have the time in the next sort of 20 minutes or so, to kind of work through everything that people want to put forward. So again, we have 2 roaming microphones. So put the hands up, they'll get you straight away. And as far as possible, I'll try and keep track of people, but the 2 roving microphones will see it anyway. Just keep your hands up. I'd say if there's anything very specific for Brian, but just generally in terms of comments, we please ask people because of the time. I'm not saying don't make comments, but if people can be aware, the longer one person goes on, the less time somebody else will have. So I should shut up, shouldn't I, and let the mics go around.
I actually just think, just in terms of our strategy, I was just at a book launch there a couple of weeks ago on austerity, and it's quite shocking when you get the opposite figures, which is the money that's actually in this country. And I think it was interesting when they were interviewing older people yesterday, they were saying, well, how will we get the money? What area of society will we take the money from to give you back, say, the bereavement grant or what? And I'm just wondering, as part of our campaign, the book that I went to was about the amount of unpaid tax that the real wealthy corporations in this country aren't paying, and it's massive, the Financial Services Centre. And I'm just wondering, as a strategy within our campaign, that every spokesperson is talking about the wealth that does exist and having the statistics, as well as the statistics that Brian is putting forward, because I think that's the question that people keep saying, is where will we get the money from, and you have to take it from somewhere else. And I would believe that we should, strategy-wise, be saying there's wealth in this country. In fact, profits went up for, I think, about 5 corporations last year, and that's where our money should come from.
I think we are losing the media war, and the opposition has an army of PR experts and propaganda at work, and that we need to start developing that kind of media strategy and that war in relation to, I think particularly what's absent is the voice of the reality of the experience of people. It never gets anywhere, even discussions. But
just going from what Mel had said, and I think we've discussed this a few times, I think we actually need to bring people together like James Riley, Phil Hogan, Alex White, Kathleen Lynch, those kind of people that are making the decisions. Because, James Riley would say, I understand all these issues and what we need to do, but at the end of the day, they're cutting stuff like interim funding from one project, from a project worker or something like that, and they're actually ended up closing down projects, because projects have to survive on both interim and mainstream funding, and I actually genuinely don't think they understand those complexities. And if they're not going to come together, then we need to look at opposition, and they're the ones that are screaming the other end at them. So maybe do we bring all the opposition together and have this conversation, because it is a very complex issue, and I genuinely don't think they understand that.
We were just talking about media campaign as well, and we were just saying, given that Love Hate is the most popular programme, and the actors are probably the most popular people in the country at the moment. If we could get the actors to back the campaign and actually say that it's not a glamorous lifestyle and that it's actually a very lonely road, and highlight the negative aspect as opposed to the glamorisation of it.
In rural Ireland, in Donegal, they have closed down the police stations. People's living in fear. We need to put this message through to the TDs and to the people here that that's what is happening. There's no Gardaí, they cut them back. If they put on new Gardaí now, it will take 2 years. So there's no Gardaí when the guards retires now. And that's why we're leaving it all open to the criminals, that they can come in and rob us and do etc. And there's nobody there to protect us. Please stand up and be spoken. Thank you.
Just a point, and I made at the table at the workshops, it's just in terms of what was said earlier on and what was on the DVD that was shown earlier. And it's in terms of frontline services. What is defined as a frontline service? Now, the organisation I work for is primarily education of the adult community. But also for young people, there is a huge lack of education. And I suppose the point that I'm making to Citywide in terms of its policy is we have a national drug strategy which has in 35 pillars, education prevention being one of those pillars. And I think that it all has to be looked at, because if a campaign like this is excluded, well, government are going to take that on. So there are the other pillars that need to be addressed in that as well.
Just in response to a couple of things, particularly around the question that was asked about the spokespersons being invited. They weren't invited to this meeting today. I'll be honest, I'll tell you the truth about today's meeting. When we decided to have this, I said at the start about we hadn't had a campaign meeting for a while. And to be honest with you, we didn't know if people would come. That's the truth, because we understand that it's really hard for people to get to these meetings, first of all, because everyone's under huge pressure in their own jobs and stuff. It's one of the things that's happened actually as a result of all that's gone on over the last few years. It's been much harder for people to network, and it's been much harder for people to come together. So we weren't sure, and it's brilliant that so many people have taken the time to come along. That is really, really important. So what we would be thinking about is if this is possible, to say every person who is here, if it is possible for every person who is in this room now to say that they would be able to get 4 more people to another meeting. We have 130 people here today. I think if everyone brought another 4, I'm no good at maths, but that would make what, 500 or 600 people. And to that meeting we would invite the politicians, because when we invite them, we want to have I suppose as big a show of people as we can. We can certainly do that. Maybe that's something we should aim to do in January. Is we get back in touch with if all of you can think of another 4 people, which I'm sure you can, that you can bring along. Obviously too, there's other people who weren't able to make it today. But we aim to have a bigger meeting at which we would invite all of those people. And the point I just want to respond to, it's absolutely true that the point that was made, I think it was Deirdre made about the media war, the fact even that we're not, whatever it is, hashtag Twitter today. You know, there is the whole social media thing out there. That's in a big way where campaigns are fought now. And one of the things we're looking at from today in terms of just some of the feedback from today is trying to produce a number of short kind of video clips which can go up on YouTube, and I always get lost when I start to talk about this because I don't know anything about it. But we are aware that that's where a lot of the kind of issues are generated. That's how you generate attention for your issues, and we do need to look at that. So there are 2 things we definitely do. You know, 2 practical things we can kind of do straight away. And then obviously a lot of the other suggestions fit in around that in terms of issues that we can identify. But if we gave ourselves the goal of another meeting in January where we would ask all of the relevant political representatives along, we can certainly do that.